A police officer and a retired German shepherd named Max were moving quietly through the frosty streets of Portland when they found her. A little girl sitting alone on the cold hotel steps, clutching a worn-out rabbit as tears streamed down her cheeks. She whispered, "Please arrest my dad. He hurt me." And the weight in her words was enough to stop the officer's heart. What he uncovered next was not a crime of cruelty, but a hidden truth that would break his heart, challenge his faith, and change an entire community forever. What followed is a story of love, redemption, and the quiet miracles that still exist in our world. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. And if you believe no child should ever suffer in silence, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear may forever change the way you see the world. The winter morning in Portland, Oregon, carried with it a sharp bite that cut through coats and gloves, a kind of chill that seemed to crawl beneath the skin and settle deep in the bones. The city streets were slick with a thin sheet of frost, the pale sun struggling to pierce through low gray clouds that clung stubbornly above the Willamette River. The air smelled faintly of wet pavement and chimney smoke, a mixture of urban life and lingering winter dampness. On a narrow street near the downtown district, the quiet routine of the morning was broken by a small, trembling figure sitting on the cold stone steps of a large hotel, her sobs echoing faintly against the glass doors. Her name was Grace Miller, just 6 years old, with the kind of fragile frame that made her look smaller than her age. She had long, light brown hair tangled into messy strands that stuck to her damp cheeks, and her eyes, a deep hazel, were swollen and red from crying. She wore a faded pink jacket, far too thin for the biting Portland air, with a missing button and sleeves frayed at the ends. Grace clutched her stomach with one hand and held tightly to a ragged stuffed rabbit in the other. Her face, pale and streaked with tears, carried not only the pain of a child's stomachache, but the heavy weight of confusion and betrayal no 6-year-old should ever know. She had whispered to strangers who passed, though none stopped. Finally, with a voice broken by sobs, she muttered the words that chilled the heart of the first responder who heard them. "Arrest my dad. He hurt me." That first responder was Officer Ethan Parker, a Portland police officer in his late 30s. Ethan was a man shaped by years of walking the city streets, his tall and broad-shouldered frame marked by the quiet authority of someone who had seen both the best and worst of humanity. His short dark brown hair was peppered with strands of gray at the temples, and his steel blue eyes carried a depth of weariness earned from 10 years on the force. Beneath the uniform and the badge, however, Ethan was also a father to an 8-year-old boy, and that was the part of him that responded most immediately when he spotted Grace. Ethan had a reputation among colleagues as calm and deliberate, rarely raising his voice, preferring to diffuse tension with patience. But behind his steady exterior lay a man haunted by the memory of losing his younger sister to illness when he was a teenager, an event that had left him fiercely protective of children in ways he didn't always admit aloud. As Ethan pulled his patrol car to the curb and stepped out into the frigid air, his breath rising in a thin cloud, he approached Grace slowly, lowering himself to her level. The sound of the city moved around them, cars humming, a bus hissing to a stop, people clutching coffee cups and hurrying past. But in that moment, the world felt narrowed to the little girl and the officer kneeling before her. "Hey there, sweetheart," Ethan said softly, keeping his tone calm and non-threatening. "My name is Ethan. I'm a police officer. Are you lost?" Grace flinched at the sight of him, clutching her stuffed rabbit tighter against her chest. Her lips trembled, and she shook her head, but then nodded, a confusing bundle of fear and desperation. Her sobs were almost silent, but she forced out words between hiccups. "Daddy, he hurt me. Please, make him stop." Ethan's chest tightened as he heard those words. A decade of training told him to stay composed, to follow procedure, but the father in him wanted to scoop her up and promise her the world would never harm her again. He kept his voice gentle. "You're not in any trouble, Grace. I just want to help. Can you tell me what hurts?" "My tummy," she cried, pressing both hands against her stomach. "He gives me food and water and then it hurts." It hurt so bad her words were tangled with the unfiltered logic of a child. But the sincerity in her eyes pierced through Ethan's professional caution. Just then, a low bark sounded from across the street. Out of the shadows emerged a large German shepherd. His name was Max, 5 years old, with a muscular build, a thick black and tan coat that shimmered even under the dull winter sun, and piercing amber eyes that seemed to read every detail of the scene before him. Max was not a stray. He wore a sturdy but worn leather collar, the tag engraved with a simple name, Max. He had once served in Portland's K-9 unit, trained for obedience, search, and protection, but an injury to his hind leg during a chase had forced early retirement. Since then, he had been adopted temporarily by a kind but elderly janitor who let him roam near the hotel where Grace's father worked. Max was known to wander the block, often lying near the Miller family's apartment building as though keeping watch. On this morning, Max's ears pricked at the sound of Grace's cries, and he bounded forward with surprising agility for a dog with a slight limp. His presence was commanding. He was tall at the shoulders, his breath forming white puffs in the cold air, and his growl rumbled softly as if to warn anyone who dared harm the child. Grace's tearful eyes lit up for a brief second when she saw him. She reached out a trembling hand, and Max pressed his head gently against her arm, letting out a reassuring whine. Ethan observed the interaction closely. Dogs often sense things that humans overlooked, and Max's protective stance ears forward, body angled slightly between Grace and the street spoke volumes. Ethan had seen K-9 dogs in action before, but there was something particularly striking about the way this animal positioned himself like a living shield for the girl. "Is this your dog, Grace?" Ethan asked softly. Grace sniffled, shaking her head. "No, but he always comes. He always finds me." Her small fingers twisted in Max's fur, clinging as though the shepherd was the only solid thing left in her unraveling world. Passers-by slowed to glance at the scene. A little girl clinging to a dog, a police officer crouched beside her. The morning's rush momentarily interrupted by a tableau that tugged at human conscience. Some whispered, others hurried past, but Ethan's focus never wavered from the girl and the dog who refused to leave her side. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small notepad, jotting down the details she had given. Yet his instincts told him that the case unfolding here would not be solved by notes alone. The desperation in Grace's words, the silent testimony in Max's posture, and the way her frail body shook with pain, these were pieces of a puzzle that ran deeper than a simple case of a lost child. "Grace," Ethan said gently, "would you like to sit in my car for a little while? It's warm inside. Max can come too if he wants." The child hesitated, then nodded faintly. Max gave a short, approving bark as if sealing the decision. Ethan guided them carefully toward the patrol car, his senses heightened, his mind already turning over possibilities. He had walked into many investigations before, but something about this morning felt heavier, more personal. A little girl's plea, a loyal dog's protective instincts, and the shadow of an unseen pain, together they marked the beginning of a story that would shake the city of Portland. As the door of the patrol car closed gently behind Grace and Max curled loyally at her side, Ethan realized this was not going to be just another call logged into the day's report. This was the beginning of something that would demand answers, demand justice, and perhaps demand redemption for more than just the family at the center of it. The patrol car hummed softly as Officer Ethan Parker steered through the slushy streets of Portland. The heater blasted warm air, fogging the edges of the windshield, while outside the sidewalks shimmered with ice and patches of dirty snow. Inside, Grace Miller sat small and silent in the back seat, clutching her stuffed rabbit in one arm and pressing the other hand against her stomach. Beside her, Max, the German shepherd, sat upright, his amber eyes fixed on the passing streets as though guarding every turn of the ride. Occasionally, he leaned his head toward Grace, nudging her with quiet reassurance. Ethan stole glances at the rearview mirror. Grace's face was still wet from tears, but there was a hint of trust forming in her gaze each time her eyes met his. Max's steady presence seemed to anchor her. Ethan's chest tightened. Something about this case was already different. He guided the car into a worn-down neighborhood on the east side of the city. Rows of tired brick buildings stood under the pale light, their windows streaked with condensation and grime. Trash bins overflowed with forgotten Christmas wrappings, and graffiti sprawled across cracked walls. Ethan parked outside Pineview Apartments, a 4-story building with faded paint and a crooked sign hanging near the entrance. "Grace," Ethan said gently, turning in his seat, "This is your home, isn't it?" She nodded, her fingers digging into the rabbit's fur. Max gave a low whine, as if confirming her answer. The entrance door creaked open as they approached, revealing a dim hallway with flickering fluorescent lights. The air smelled faintly of mildew and rust. Ethan could feel Max tense beside him, the dog's nose twitching as though the building itself carried secrets. Inside apartment 4B sat Daniel Miller, Grace's father. Daniel was 38, his once strong frame now worn thin from endless work shifts. His dark hair was unkempt, streaked with premature gray, and stubble shadowed his tired face. His clothes were plain faded jeans and a hotel maintenance jacket still streaked with dust. Daniel had the rough hands of a laborer, calloused and scarred from years of odd jobs. Life had left deep grooves around his eyes, not just from exhaustion, but from carrying the weight of responsibility alone. He loved his daughter fiercely, but poverty had stripped him of choices, leaving him ashamed and defensive. That morning, he was hunched over the small kitchen table, trying to stretch the last of the groceries into something resembling lunch. An almost empty jar of peanut butter sat open beside 2 slices of bread that had begun to harden at the edges. A water bottle, half filled from the rust-stained tap, rested near his hand. He sighed, rubbing his temples. He had promised Grace things would get better, but his promises felt as thin as the bread he was holding. From the bedroom, a faint sound drifted, a low sigh, followed by silence. That was Hannah Miller, Grace's mother. Hannah was 34, slender with long chestnut hair that once gleamed with health but now hung limp, often unwashed. Her green eyes, once bright, seemed dulled by a fog she could not escape. She rarely left the bed these days, trapped in the suffocating grip of untreated postpartum depression that had begun after Grace was born and only worsened with the family's financial decline. She was gentle by nature, soft-spoken and kind in her better moments, but guilt and sadness had silenced her voice. Her absence weighed heavily on Grace, who longed for a mother's embrace, but instead found only the shadow of one. Daniel turned as the knock on the door startled him. He opened it to find Officer Ethan Parker, his daughter standing beside him with Max pressing protectively close. Daniel's eyes widened, a mix of relief and fear. "Grace!" he exclaimed, pulling her into his arms. His voice cracked with worry. "Where have you been? I thought I lost you." Grace stiffened in his embrace, her small frame rigid. She didn't push him away, but her eyes darted to Ethan, unsure. Ethan's instincts sharpened. "Mr. Miller," Ethan said calmly, his professional tone returning. "We need to talk." Grace was found outside the hotel. She said some things that concerned me. Daniel swallowed hard, guilt flickering across his face. She's been sick. Her stomach. I didn't mean for her to wander off. I was working." His voice wavered. Ethan noticed the cracked linoleum floor, the faint smell of dampness, and the water stains on the ceiling. Max growled softly, nose pointed toward the kitchen sink, where a brown ring of rust circled the drain. Ethan's eyes narrowed, filing the detail away. A sudden knock interrupted them. The door creaked open to reveal Mrs. Ellison, the neighbor from next door. She was in her late 60s, with silver hair pulled into a neat bun and sharp gray eyes that missed nothing. A retired schoolteacher, she carried herself with a stern but caring demeanor, the kind of woman who noticed every child in the building and often scolded tenants for leaving trash in the hall. She held a grocery bag filled with canned soup and bread. "Daniel," she said curtly, her gaze moving to Grace, "I heard the commotion. Is she all right? That little one's been looking pale for weeks." "She's fine," Daniel muttered quickly, avoiding her eyes. "Just a stomach bug." Mrs. Ellison pursed her lips. "A bug doesn't last for months, and she told me last week the water tastes funny." Her eyes softened as she glanced at Grace. "She's a smart girl." "Don't ignore her." Ethan watched the exchange, noting the neighbor's concern. He thanked Mrs. Ellison politely, and she gave Max a small smile before retreating back to her apartment. Inside, tension thickened. Grace sat quietly at the table, nibbling at the crust of bread her father offered, while Max lay at her feet, ears alert. Hannah stirred in the bedroom, her faint voice calling out, "Is everything okay?" Daniel hesitated, then muttered a tired reassurance before shutting the door halfway. Ethan decided to stay longer, asking gentle questions about Grace's health, her routines, and the apartment conditions. Daniel answered defensively at first, but slowly his exhaustion cracked through his pride. He admitted he hadn't taken Grace to a doctor because he couldn't afford it, and the landlord ignored his complaints about the water. His voice broke when he added, "I'm trying. I swear I'm trying." Ethan nodded, though his concern deepened. The case wasn't clear yet, but the pieces didn't fit the picture of abuse. Something else lurked beneath the surface, something hidden in the walls, in the pipes, in the silence of the building. As Ethan prepared to leave, Grace tugged at his sleeve. "Officer Parker," she whispered, "please don't make me drink the water here anymore. It makes the fist in my tummy come back." Her eyes, wide and pleading, cut into him more sharply than any report could. Max gave a short bark as if punctuating her plea. Ethan bent down, placing a steady hand on Grace's shoulder. "I'm going to figure this out," he promised. His voice carried a weight that surprised even him. "I won't let the fist hurt you again." The officer stepped back into the cold hallway, Max's growl fading behind the door. Snowflakes had begun to fall outside, covering the cracked sidewalks in a thin white layer. Ethan pulled his coat tighter, his mind racing. This wasn't just about one little girl anymore. This was the shadow of something bigger, and he intended to uncover it. The following morning brought a brittle sunlight that spilled unevenly over Portland's rooftops, casting sharp contrasts between shadows and brightness. Frost still clung to parked cars, glittering faintly as the city stirred awake. Inside Pineview Apartments, life was less luminous. The walls of apartment 4B seemed to hold on to the damp cold, every corner whispering of neglect. Grace Miller awoke, curled on the threadbare couch, clutching her rabbit tightly. Max, the German shepherd, had settled beside her during the night, his heavy frame warming the small space. His ears twitched at every creak of the building, and his amber eyes half opened whenever Grace stirred. For the first time in days, she had slept deeply, protected by his steady presence. Daniel Miller, exhausted, had already left for his morning shift at the hotel. His shoulders had slumped when he closed the door, carrying both hope and dread that the day might provide enough money for another week of rent. Hannah remained in the bedroom, unmoving, cocooned in blankets as though the weight of the world pressed her down. Grace's stomach gave its familiar twist, the invisible fist returning. She pressed a hand to her belly and whispered to Max, "It hurts again." The dog whined softly, resting his head on her lap. Grace's eyes brimmed with tears, and a dangerous thought grew inside her. Maybe Daddy was the reason. She remembered the words she had told Officer Parker the day before. In her child's mind, patterns became truths. Her tummy always hurt after the food and water her father gave her. That was the logic of her world. Later that day, Ethan Parker returned to the neighborhood, compelled by a gnawing unease. He wore a plain brown coat over his uniform, blending into the flow of pedestrians. He wanted to observe before stepping in too firmly. He saw Grace outside, sitting on the front steps with Max by her side, her doll dangling from her arm. She looked smaller than ever against the backdrop of the sagging building. "Morning, Princess," Ethan greeted softly, crouching down to her eye level again. Grace managed a faint smile but said nothing. Max barked once, low but steady, his body leaning protectively toward the girl. Ethan was about to ask if she was feeling better when another figure approached. Detective Sarah Murphy, the one assigned to child welfare cases in this district. Sarah was in her early 40s, tall and lean with cropped auburn hair streaked by early gray. Her hazel eyes were sharp, her expression perpetually serious. Years of working abuse cases had carved both resilience and cynicism into her character. She carried herself like someone who had seen too many children suffer and had little patience for excuses. Behind her clipped tone and businesslike suits lay a woman shaped by personal loss. Her younger brother had been permanently disabled after years in foster care neglect. That history made her relentless, sometimes overly so. "Officer Parker," Sarah said curtly, giving him a quick nod. "We need to move quickly. I had a call from the hospital yesterday. The girl's symptoms match potential neglect or worse. We can't sit on this." Ethan frowned. "Sarah, I think there's more to it than neglect. The conditions in the apartment are bad, yes, but—" Sarah cut him off. "Bad conditions don't explain months of stomach pain. She says her father gives her things that make her sick. Children don't invent that kind of detail. We have to take her statement seriously." Her eyes softened for a brief second as she looked at Grace. We can't risk sending her back into harm's way." Grace looked between the two adults, her hazel eyes clouded with fear and confusion. Max growled low, sensing the rising tension. By late afternoon, the decision was made. Ethan's protests were noted, but Sarah's authority carried weight. Officers were dispatched to the hotel where Daniel Miller was working. Daniel was scrubbing the marble floor of the lobby when they came. He wore his gray maintenance uniform, his hair damp with sweat, his hands red from cleaning chemicals. His heart dropped when he saw two officers approaching with grim expressions. "Daniel Miller?" one asked, voice flat. "Yes," he answered cautiously, standing slowly. "Is something wrong? Is Grace—" "You need to come with us, sir," the officer interrupted. "We have questions down at the station." Daniel's manager, a portly man named Mr. Reeves, hovered nearby, frowning. Guests in elegant coats paused, watching as Daniel's face drained of color. "Please," Daniel pleaded, his voice cracking, "just tell me if my daughter is okay." "Your daughter is safe," the second officer replied. "That's all we can say right now." Humiliation washed over Daniel as he was led out through the gleaming glass doors into the waiting car. He felt like a criminal, though his only crime was poverty and desperation. Back at Pineview Apartments, Grace clutched Max's fur as neighbors whispered in the hallway. Mrs. Ellison, the elderly neighbor, shook her head in disapproval but said nothing directly. Grace overheard bits of conversations. They took her father away. "Poor child. Knew something was wrong." Each word was a needle pressing deeper into her small heart. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Daniel sat in a gray interrogation room under harsh fluorescent lights. Detective Sarah Murphy entered with her file, setting it down with deliberate care. She studied him with eyes that had seen countless denials before. "Mr. Miller," she began, her voice clipped, "your daughter alleges that you are the source of her pain, that when you give her food or water, she becomes sick. Why would she say that?" Daniel's face went pale. His lips trembled. "What? Number. That's not possible. She's been sick, yes, but I would never hurt her. She's all I have." His voice cracked with emotion, but to Sarah it sounded like every other father's plea she had heard. Ethan watched from the observation room, his jaw tight. He had seen Daniel's exhaustion, his desperate love for Grace. It didn't fit the profile. Still, procedure bound him, and doubt lingered. Back at the hospital, Grace was placed in a small, child-friendly ward with pastel walls and cartoon murals. There she met Claire Donovan, a social worker in her mid-30s, with warm brown eyes and curly hair tied back neatly. Claire was known for her patient, empathetic approach. Unlike Sarah, she never pressed too hard. She had a gentle voice, one that coaxed truths out of frightened children. She sat beside Grace's bed, pulling 2 dolls from her bag. "This is Lily," Claire said softly, "and sometimes Lily gets a tummy ache. Can you show me where it hurts?" Grace pointed to the doll's stomach, whispering, "Right here, after Daddy gives me water." Her words were quiet but clear. Claire noted it carefully, though something in her gut told her the phrasing was unusual. It sounded clinical, almost like observation rather than accusation. But she set that aside for now. The system demanded she file the report, as stated. Max, allowed inside due to Grace's insistence, curled up at her bedside, refusing to leave. Nurses exchanged bemused glances, but no one had the heart to separate them. Grace's small hand rested on his fur even as sleep overtook her, her trust in the shepherd unwavering. Back at the precinct, Sarah pressed Daniel harder, her questions sharp, her tone unyielding. 3 jobs in 2 years, rent always late, wife incapacitated, and now your daughter says you hurt her. Tell me, Mr. Miller, why should I believe otherwise? Daniel buried his face in his hands. "Because I love her," he whispered hoarsely. "Because I'd rather die than hurt her." But the walls felt deaf to his pleas. The misunderstanding had become a trap, and the shadows of suspicion weighed heavy. At Pinewood General Hospital, the pale winter light streamed faintly through tall windows, bouncing off sterile white walls that hummed with the quiet rhythm of machines. Grace Miller lay curled on her bed, her small frame dwarfed by the stiff hospital sheets. Max, the German shepherd, refused to leave her side, resting his head on the mattress with watchful amber eyes. Nurses walked past, some smiling at the unusual sight of a retired K-9 in a children's ward, but no one dared move him. He seemed to belong there as much as the child did. Dr. Olivia Carter, the attending pediatrician, entered the room with her usual calm energy. Olivia was 36, tall and slender, with sandy blonde hair tied into a loose bun and clear green eyes sharpened by years of experience. Her white coat, faintly wrinkled from long shifts, hung easily on her shoulders. Olivia was known among staff for her blend of precision and compassion. She never rushed her patients, believing that children revealed more in silence than under pressure. She had chosen pediatrics after losing a cousin to an undiagnosed illness when she was young, a memory that pushed her to search relentlessly for answers when others gave up. Olivia bent down near Grace's bed, smiling warmly. "How's our little warrior today?" she asked. Grace gave a faint shrug, whispering, "My tummy still feels like fists." Her hand brushed over Max's fur as though drawing courage from his steady presence. Olivia nodded thoughtfully, listening to the tone more than the words. She had already examined Grace earlier, but the results troubled her. There were no bruises, no marks, nothing to suggest physical harm. Yet the child was clearly in pain, malnourished, and fatigued. It didn't align with the simple narrative of abuse. Later that afternoon, Olivia met with Claire Donovan, the social worker who had interviewed Grace. Claire carried her notepad, her expression concerned. "She keeps repeating the same thing after Daddy gives me water." The investigators are fixated on that detail. But, she hesitated, lowering her voice. "It doesn't feel like an accusation. It feels like observation." Olivia leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Exactly. Children don't describe pain in metaphors unless they've lived with it. The fist she talks about, that's cramping, and linking it to water, it's too specific to ignore." Claire tilted her head. "So, you think it isn't him?" "I think we're missing the real culprit," Olivia replied firmly. "And if we don't find it, she'll keep suffering." While they spoke, Max suddenly rose from his spot, ears pricking. He padded to the sink in the corner of the room where a glass of tap water sat untouched. The shepherd sniffed, then growled low, his nose wrinkling in clear disgust. Olivia followed his gaze, startled. "Interesting," she murmured. She poured the water into a sterile container, sealing it for testing. Sometimes instincts beat science. She looked down at Max, who wagged his tail once as if satisfied. That evening, Olivia reviewed medical files in her small, cluttered office. She cross-referenced Grace's symptoms with local health alerts. A troubling pattern emerged, scattered complaints in the East Portland district about gastrointestinal illness, many unresolved. The more she searched, the more it pointed not to a violent home but to something far larger and insidious. She requested a full metabolic panel and stool analysis for Grace. Hours later, the preliminary lab results confirmed her suspicion. Signs of infection consistent with contaminated water. She needed more proof, but the picture was becoming clear. Meanwhile, Ethan Parker couldn't let the case rest. Though Detective Sarah Murphy was pressing charges against Daniel Miller, Ethan's instincts whispered otherwise. He drove back to Pineview Apartments, accompanied by Max, who seemed eager to lead the way. Snowflakes fell softly, dusting the cracked sidewalks, while the building loomed dark and weary. Daniel's wife Hannah answered the door after a long pause. Her eyes were hollow, her face pale against the dim light of the hallway. She wore an oversized sweater, sleeves hanging past her thin wrists. "What now?" she murmured, voice brittle. "I just need to take a look at your water," Ethan explained gently. Max pushed past, nose down, tail stiff. Hannah gave a weary shrug and stepped aside. In the kitchen, Ethan filled a clear evidence bottle from the tap. The liquid ran rusty at first, then cleared, though a metallic odor lingered. Max barked sharply, his nose pressed to the damp patch beneath the sink. Ethan crouched and found a steady drip from corroded pipes, staining the floor with brown streaks. He sealed the sample, his suspicions growing heavier. On his way out, Ethan met Victor Sloan, the building manager, in the lobby. Victor was in his late 40s, heavy-set with thinning black hair slicked back and a cheap suit that strained against his belly. His eyes darted nervously as he lit a cigarette, despite the no-smoking sign above. He had a reputation among tenants as dismissive and arrogant, a man more interested in collecting rent than fixing problems. "Officer," Victor said coolly, exhaling smoke. "Something wrong?" "Just routine follow-up," Ethan replied, studying him. "How old are the pipes here?" Victor smirked. "Old buildings creak. Tenants exaggerate. Everything meets code. He flicked ash onto the floor, already turning away. Max growled, the sound deep and warning. Victor flinched, his bravado faltering for a second before he forced a laugh. "Keep your mutt on a leash, officer." Ethan watched him walk off, unease settling deeper. The next morning, Olivia Carter stood in the hospital lab staring at a microscope slide. The technician had circled the findings in red ink. Giardia lamblia cysts present. The parasite explained everything: Grace's cramping, fatigue, and worsening illness. Olivia's heart pounded with both relief and fury. The child hadn't been poisoned by malice, but by neglect of a different kind. Contaminated water allowed to fester unchecked. She immediately called Ethan. "Officer Parker, this is Dr. Carter. Your instincts were right. The girl isn't being abused. She's been drinking poison. The parasite is in the water supply." Ethan's jaw clenched as he listened, staring at the bottle of water sample in his passenger seat. Max sat upright beside him, ears alert as though he understood the gravity of the words. "Then we're going after the wrong man," Ethan muttered. "Daniel Miller is innocent." The interrogation room was colder than Daniel Miller remembered. He sat slumped on the metal chair, his hands clasped tightly together, his fingernails biting into his palms. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, relentless. Every tick of the clock hammered into him the weight of his daughter's words she hadn't meant as betrayal, but which had become a chain dragging him into suspicion. He whispered under his breath, "Grace, my little girl, please believe me." The door opened suddenly, and Officer Ethan Parker stepped in. His usually composed expression was different now, his jaw tight, his eyes carrying an urgency that cut through the fog of despair in the room. Behind him padded Max, the German shepherd, who had refused to stay away even from the police station. The dog's nails clicked softly on the tiled floor as he settled beside Daniel, his warm body a surprising comfort. "Daniel," Ethan began, voice steady but softer than before, "you're not the man we thought you were. We've been looking in the wrong place. The problem isn't you, it's the water." Daniel's head snapped up, confusion clouding his tired face. "The water?" he repeated. Dr. Olivia Carter entered then, holding a file thick with lab reports. She still wore her white coat, her blonde hair slightly frizzed from hours at the hospital. "Your daughter has giardiasis," she explained clearly. "It's a parasitic infection caused by contaminated water. The source is your apartment building's plumbing, not your care. She wasn't accusing you, she was describing her pain." Daniel's throat tightened as tears welled in his eyes. Relief clashed with guilt, a storm that left him trembling. "I gave her that water," he whispered, voice raw. "I told her it was safe because it was all we had. I failed her." Ethan placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You failed because someone else chose greed over responsibility, and that man is going to pay for it." At that moment, Detective Sarah Murphy entered, her tall frame and sharp features still commanding. She looked at Daniel with an expression that mixed regret and professional restraint. She had fought too many battles to admit she was wrong easily, but the evidence had dismantled her certainty. "Mr. Miller," she said, her tone clipped yet less harsh, "you are free to go. I owe you an apology." Daniel stood shakily, his relief so overwhelming it nearly buckled his knees. Max pressed close to him, almost herding him toward the exit. The next scene unfolded at Pineview Apartments, where Ethan, Sarah, and a team of officers descended into the dank basement with a warrant. The air was heavy with mold, the smell so strong it stung the nostrils. Their flashlights revealed corroded pipes patched haphazardly with black tape, leaking foul-smelling water into stagnant puddles. Standing nearby, his face pale but his expression defiant, was Victor Sloan, the building manager. Sloan was dressed in a too-tight navy blazer, his thinning hair damp with sweat. His eyes flicked nervously between the officers and the exposed pipes, his smirk faltering. "You can't pin this on me," Sloan protested, his voice high-pitched, laced with panic. "Old buildings always have problems. Tenants should have boiled their water. That's not my fault." Detective Sarah Murphy stepped forward, her hazel eyes sharp as knives. "You had multiple complaints logged over years. Families reported the smell, the discoloration, even the taste. You ignored them. That's not neglect, it's criminal negligence." She signaled to the officers. "Take him." As the cuffs clicked around Sloan's wrists, his bravado collapsed, leaving only a man stripped of his arrogance. Tenants gathered in the hallway above, whispering, then clapping softly as they saw him being led away. Some even cheered, though the sound carried more relief than joy. Meanwhile, in the hospital, Grace was recovering. Her cheeks had regained some color, and she giggled faintly as Max jumped onto the edge of her bed with Ethan's permission. She hugged the shepherd tightly, whispering into his fur, "You always protect me." Daniel entered the room hesitantly, his heart pounding. For a moment he froze at the sight of his daughter, afraid she would shrink away from him. But Grace's face lit up as soon as she saw him. "Daddy!" she cried, holding out her arms. Tears spilled freely down Daniel's face as he rushed to her side, dropping to his knees. "I'm so sorry, Princess," he whispered, voice breaking. "I should have listened. I should have fought harder for you. I'm so sorry." Grace pressed her small hands to his cheeks. "It's okay, Daddy. You're here now." The dog and the doctor made the fist go away. Her simple forgiveness pierced him deeper than any judgment ever could. At her bedside, Hannah sat quietly, her chestnut hair brushed for the first time in weeks, her green eyes clearer. Therapy sessions arranged by Claire Donovan had begun pulling her out of the gray fog. She reached for Daniel's hand, their fingers intertwining with a tremor of hope. Weeks later, a community meeting filled the basement of the Pinewood Community Church. Residents of Pineview Apartments, once isolated by fear, now gathered shoulder to shoulder. At the front stood Ethan, Olivia, Claire, and Daniel. Grace sat proudly with Max by her side. The dog's ears perked as though he understood he had helped spark something larger. Daniel spoke, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "For too long we stayed silent because we were afraid of being evicted, afraid of being punished for speaking the truth. But silence almost cost me my daughter. It cost all of us health, peace, and dignity. We can't stay silent anymore." The room erupted in applause, not for one man, but for the shared strength of a community finally finding its voice. Months later, the Miller family moved into a clean two-bedroom apartment across town, helped by a relocation fund secured by Olivia and Claire. Hannah slowly regained her sense of self, cooking dinner with laughter that had long been absent. Grace thrived, healthy and bright-eyed, often racing Max through the small park near their new home. Daniel found steady work as a supervisor in a construction crew, his confidence rebuilt. On a warm spring afternoon, they gathered in the park where the newly formed Portland Child Protection Society hosted its first family day. Children ran freely, parents shared stories, and the air buzzed with resilience. Ethan, in casual clothes, watched with quiet pride as Grace climbed onto her father's shoulders, Max barking joyfully at their side. "Daddy," Grace said, looking out over the park, "we can see everything from up here." Daniel smiled, tears glinting in his hazel eyes, his voice steady with a newfound certainty. "That's right, Princess. From now on, you'll always see the light." In the end, this story is not only about one family's suffering and redemption, but also about how miracles can appear in the most unexpected forms. Sometimes God sends his answers not as thunder in the sky, but as the loyalty of a dog, the compassion of a doctor, or the courage of a community that dares to speak up. Grace's healing was not just medical. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, God can turn pain into purpose and despair into hope. In our daily lives, many of us may feel unheard or overlooked, carrying silent burdens. But just as Grace's little voice and Max's steadfast loyalty awakened an entire community, your voice and your actions can be the spark that brings light into someone else's darkness. Believe in the quiet miracles around you and trust that God is always present, guiding hearts to protect and heal. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who might need encouragement. Leave your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, healing, and second chances, and join our community of hope. Let us pray that God blesses every viewer with strength, health, and love in their families. And if you believe, write Amen in the comments to stand with Grace's story and to remind the world that no child, no parent, and no family should ever be left without hope.